After his father's passing, Ethan's stepmother showed a callous disregard, forbidding him from attending the funeral. Just a week later, with a cynical smirk, she declared him an unwelcome guest at the will reading, stating that only true family members belong here. Overwhelmed with bitterness, Ethan decided not to engage in pointless arguments or give her the satisfaction of seeing his emotions. Instead, maintaining outward composure, he handed a sealed envelope, his father's last gift, to the attorney. When the attorney opened the envelope and began to read, a tense silence fell over the room. No one could have predicted what the message contained. Ethan allowed his father's words to resonate, feeling their weight and sharpness like a hammer blow. It became clear then that betrayal lay at the heart of this story. Everyone present knew Ethan had been humiliated and rejected, yet he held a key that could turn the situation around. Before delving into the details, it's worth introducing the main characters of this drama to understand what was at stake. Ethan Wade was Henry Wade's only son, raised with the belief that family was primarily about loyalty, respect, and love. However, when his father remarried, Ethan's world began to crumble. Claudia, his father's new wife, entered their lives with a deceptive smile and refined manners that concealed a cold and calculating nature. To Claudia, Ethan was merely a living reminder of his father's past life. She had 2 children of her own, Troy, a 23-year-old slacker who believed the world owed him everything, and Sierra, 20, sharp-tongued like her mother, always ready to mock and obey Claudia's instructions. Finally, there was Henry Wade, a strong and successful businessman who had once taught Ethan to ride a bike and face life without fear. However, after Claudia's arrival, Henry seemed to withdraw, becoming introverted and quiet, a shadow of his former self. This was the dynamic of the family gathered to commemorate their departed father. From this point, the story begins, the tale of a son denied a final farewell and a stepmother who deemed him unworthy even of that. Questions hung in the air. Why did Claudia hate Ethan so much? Why did his father allow her to push him away? And what was in that sealed envelope that so drastically changed her expression? Ethan had always been his father's pride and joy. Henry Wade was more than just a parent. He was a mentor, protector, and role model. Ethan remembered his father holding his bicycle until he learned to balance, running alongside him, laughing heartily, and how that laughter made him feel invincible. He remembered his father teaching him how to throw a ball, look people in the eye, shake a hand, and keep his word no matter what. For most of his childhood, Ethan believed that nothing could break their bond. But everything changed with Claudia's arrival. His father met her after Ethan's mother passed away. He was in his early 20s then, and grief had left him devastated. Claudia initially seemed charming. She had a smile straight out of a glossy magazine, and she spoke to his father with such tenderness that he was captivated. Ethan wanted to believe she could bring happiness back to his father, but cracks in their relationship appeared quite quickly. It started with small things. Claudia would interrupt Ethan when he spoke to his father, as if he weren't even there. When he came for dinner, she'd make sharp remarks about him needing to give notice of his visit, as if he were an uninvited guest. Then came more painful jabs. One evening, while his father was in the kitchen, Claudia leaned in and whispered to Ethan, "You'll always remind him of the woman he lost. He doesn't need that kind of pain." Her words stung Ethan, but it was even more painful to watch his father succumb more and more to Claudia's influence with each passing month. Claudia quickly took center stage in his father's life, consuming him entirely. She brought her own children, Troy and Sierra, who immediately claimed the house as their domain. Troy, like a spoiled prince, never bothered with work or financial contributions, yet somehow always sported new watches or the latest smartphone. Sierra, though younger, was no less arrogant, perfectly mimicking Claudia's behavior. She'd roll her eyes, quietly mutter snide remarks, and act as if Ethan were a stranger in the home where he had grown up. His father, of course, noticed what was happening. Sometimes, Ethan would catch a flicker of guilt in his eyes when Claudia pushed him away. But he never intervened, perhaps aiming to keep the peace, or maybe simply weary of the struggle. With each passing year, Ethan felt the distance between them grow. His calls were often intercepted by Claudia, who'd inform him that his father was too busy or tired. Attempts to arrange fishing trips together constantly fell through. Eventually, Ethan stopped trying. He learned about his father's serious health deterioration, not from him directly, but from a distant relative who happened to see them at the hospital. Arriving immediately, Ethan was filled with anxiety and a desperate desire to see his father. But Claudia blocked his way at the door, arms crossed over her chest. "Stress is strictly forbidden for him right now," she declared. "He needs peace, not old grievances stirred up." Ethan's attempt to pass her was futile. He'd never forget the icy glare in her eyes when she uttered, "You only think about yourself, not him." In that moment, Ethan realized he was losing his father not just to illness, but to her manipulations. Despite everything, Ethan continued to hope that his father felt his care, that somewhere deep down he knew of his love. He wrote letters, left voicemails, using every opportunity to connect. Sometimes replies came, short messages or notes. They weren't verbose, but they contained his voice, his handwriting, a reminder of their former closeness. On the day he was informed of his father's passing, Ethan sat in his car for an hour, unable to move. A gaping void formed in his chest, as if all the air had been sucked out of him. He tormented himself with thoughts of missed moments, of unspoken words. He convinced himself he could make everything right at the funeral, that he would be by his side one last time, honor his memory, and remind everyone that he was his son. But even in that hour of grief, Claudia struck. At the church, where Ethan arrived in a black suit with a bouquet of white lilies, she waited for him on the steps. She cast a disdainful look at him, as if he were a stranger, and without hesitation or regard for onlookers declared, "You're not welcome here, Ethan. These are for family, real family." Her words hit him harder than he expected. People turned, some looking away uncomfortably, others whispering. Ethan froze, holding the flowers, which suddenly felt impossibly heavy. His throat was dry, but he refused to let her see his weakness. Leaving the bouquet on the steps, he turned and walked away. That evening, sitting in his empty apartment, Ethan stared at the ceiling. Grief overwhelmed him, but beneath its shroud something else was brewing, a firm resolve. He knew his father loved him, despite anything Claudia said, and he understood that this wasn't the end of the story. The week after the funeral was the hardest of his life. A gloom settled within him like a dark cloud refusing to dissipate. Images from the church replayed in his mind repeatedly, where he, like an uninvited guest, watched his father being buried. He should have been there. He should have said goodbye. Instead, shame and fury tore at him, battling for control. Ethan tried to move on, but Claudia wouldn't let him. The day after the funeral, he received a short message from a law firm, an official notification about the reading of his father's will. He felt a surge of relief. Whatever Claudia thought, she couldn't erase him from his life. He was Henry Wade's only son, and none of her efforts could change that fact. Anticipating the crucial moment that would decide his future, Ethan arrived at the law office dressed in a somber black suit, smelling faintly of mothballs, a relic of bygone days. Despite his clammy hands, he walked through the glass doors with his head held high, ready to assert his right to his inheritance. The secretary, looking up from her papers, gave him a questioning glance, and he clearly stated his name. After a brief search of the list, her face clouded with confusion. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Wade, but your name isn't on the list," she said, as if delivering a harsh verdict. Ethan's chest tightened painfully, as if struck. "This can't be! I'm his son!" flashed through his mind. But before he could react, a sharp, derisive laugh pierced the silence. It was Claudia, emerging from the waiting area like a predator biding its time. She wore an elegant black dress, her hair impeccably styled, and her face exuded smug triumph. Behind her, like loyal bodyguards, loomed Troy and Sierra, leaning against the wall. Claudia tilted her head and gave him a smile that oozed the kind of undisguised cruelty only she was capable of. "Ethan, what are you doing here? This isn't for you. This is for Henry's family." Ethan's hands involuntarily clenched into fists, but he forced himself to maintain an outward calm. "I am his family. I am his only son." Troy scoffed dismissively. "Doesn't look like it to us." Sierra, arms crossed, added, "Maybe you should take a hint and leave before you embarrass yourself." Each word stung like acid, gnawing at his soul, but Ethan had no intention of backing down. Turning back to the secretary, he stated firmly, "My father is Henry Wade. You cannot proceed with the will reading without my presence." The secretary, visibly flustered, looked confusedly from Ethan to Claudia. Claudia, placing a hand on the table, leaned forward and said in an icy tone, "Don't listen to him. Henry made it perfectly clear who was important to him. This boy hasn't been a part of his life for years. He's just an uninvited guest." The word boy burned Ethan like a brand. He was 34, yet she used it as a weapon to humiliate him, to erase him from his father's memory. His heart pounded, and for a moment he felt himself losing control. He wanted to shout, to unleash all the pent-up rage. But at that moment, he felt the weight in his jacket pocket, the sealed envelope. He remembered the night his father, with a weak but firm hand, placed it in his palm. His father's voice had trembled, but his eyes held a calm resolve. "Son, no matter what happens, remember, you are my blood. Keep this safe. Use it when the time comes." Ethan hadn't understood the meaning of those words then, but now, standing in that law office, looking at Claudia's smug smirk, he realized the time had come. Squaring his shoulders, he looked Claudia directly in the eye and said, "You can laugh all you want, but I'm not leaving." Her smile widened even further. "Then, by all means, make a fool of yourself. You'll soon realize what place you hold in your father's life." The attorney appeared in the doorway, an elderly man with gray hair and a piercing gaze from behind his spectacles. "We are ready to begin," he announced. Claudia, triumphant, swept past him, with Troy and Sierra following closely. As she passed, she leaned in and whispered, "Get ready, Ethan. You're about to find out what your father really thought of you." Ethan didn't reply. There was no need. His hand brushed the envelope in his pocket, and that was enough to find calm. In the conference room, the air crackled with tension. Claudia and her children settled comfortably into leather chairs around the polished oak table. Ethan, however, took a seat at the far end, feeling their piercing stares, as if he were an unwelcome intruder. Claudia, legs crossed, leaned back in her chair, her face expressing a smug anticipation of victory. The attorney cleared his throat and announced, "We are gathered here to review the last will and testament of Henry Wade." Claudia, casting a disdainful glance his way, added, "Let's get this over with. Some of us here actually belong." Ethan remained silent, refusing to rise to the provocation. His heart pounded, but his resolve was unshaken. He wasn't going to shout, wasn't going to beg. He intended to fulfill his father's last wish. The attorney opened a folder and began to read the formal introduction. Words filled with legal jargon and procedural details drifted past Ethan's consciousness, but all his attention was fixed on the envelope in his pocket. He could feel Claudia's eyes darting to him, waiting for him to break, to run. But he sat motionless, like a rock, biding his time. It was a conflict in its purest form. A son fighting not only for his father's memory, but for his place in a family that sought to erase him. Claudia was confident in her superiority, believing her cruelty would break him. She didn't know he possessed a weapon given to him by his father, a weapon she could never take away. And when the time came, he would be ready to use it. A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the attorney's monotonous voice reading the introductory part of the will. The legalistic language sounded dry and detached, as if unrelated to the emotions raging within Ethan. His gaze was fixed on the polished oak table, but every cell of his body burned with internal tension. Across from him, Claudia, with a smug smirk, seemed to relish his predicament. Her manicured hand rested casually on the armrest of her chair. Troy, leaning back with his arms crossed, also made no secret of his triumph. Sierra, in turn, whispered something into her mother's ear, and both occasionally cast mocking glances Ethan's way. From the outside, Ethan probably looked like a pathetic sight, a rejected son hoping for a meager share of his father's inheritance. That was precisely the impression Claudia aimed for, confident that the will reading would finally break him. However, she had no idea what he held in his pocket. He distinctly remembered the moment his father handed him that item, as if it had happened only yesterday. Late one evening, defying Claudia's wishes, Ethan had gone to see his father. His health was rapidly deteriorating, and he knew his chances of seeing him were dwindling each day. His father sat in his armchair by the window, gaunt and pale, but in his eyes still burned that piercing fire that always appeared when he wanted Ethan to listen carefully. "Ethan," he said in a weak but firm voice. "I know it hasn't been easy for you. I know Claudia has done everything she can to push you away, but you are my son. That will never change." Ethan swallowed hard, holding back the tears he didn't want his father to see. His father reached for a drawer next to his chair and pulled out a sealed envelope. He placed it in Ethan's hand and held it for a moment. His grip was no longer strong, but a firm resolve resonated within it. Something told Ethan he meant every word. "Keep this safe. Don't open it. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." Ethan looked at him in confusion, but his father merely shook his head slightly. "Trust me, son. You'll understand." Those were some of the last words his father spoke to him in person. At that moment, Ethan had no idea what the envelope contained or why his father chose to give it to him in secret. But now, with Claudia sitting across from him, anticipating his complete disinheritance, everything became perfectly clear. The attorney proceeded to read the main provisions of the will: a trust fund for Claudia, a modest allowance for her children, the right to dispose of household items, and small investments. Claudia's face beamed with pleasure, as if every word was sweet music to her ears. She leaned forward slightly, clearly anticipating something more. Ethan, however, waited patiently, maintaining outward composure. His pulse quickened, but his resolve remained unshaken. He wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't going to beg. He intended to fulfill his father's last wish. When the attorney paused to turn some pages, Ethan took the treasured envelope from his jacket pocket. Its rustle in the quiet room sounded like a clap of thunder to him. Carefully placing the envelope on the table, he slid it toward the attorney. "I have something," Ethan said in a calm but firm voice. "My father gave this to me before he died. He asked me to ensure it was read here and now." The attorney looked up in surprise. Claudia burst into a contemptuous, venomous laugh. "Oh, for heaven's sake, what is this foolish stunt now? A childish attempt to get attention?" Troy snorted. "Pathetic." Sierra rolled her eyes. "Honestly, Ethan, you should know when to quit." Ethan ignored them. His gaze was fixed on the attorney, who now held the envelope, his brows furrowed as he examined it closely. His father's handwriting was clearly visible on the envelope, his full name written across the seal. "This is authentic," the attorney murmured. He put on his glasses and carefully opened the envelope. The sound of tearing paper broke the silence in the room. Claudia's smirk faltered for the first time. "What is it?" she demanded. The attorney raised a hand, silencing her, and unfolded the document. He quickly scanned the page, then slowed, frowning. Clearing his throat, he prepared to read. Claudia leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Well, what does it say?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, hands calmly on his lap, though his heart pounded in his chest. The moment his father had prepared him for had arrived. The moment Ethan had to honor his trust and preserve his last words. The attorney's voice took on an entirely different tone as he began to read aloud. It was no longer detached and formal, but filled with deep thoughtfulness and poignancy. These were his father's words, not dry legal jargon. In the conference room, an addendum to the will resonated like a thunderclap. "To my son, Ethan Wade, my own flesh and blood, I bequeath everything, my property, business assets, and personal valuables. Claudia and her offspring were generously provided for during my lifetime. Now, of sound mind and memory, I deny them any further assistance. My will is unyielding, and my signature and witness attest to it." The atmosphere instantly grew tense. Claudia froze, her smug mask falling away. Troy was dumbfounded, and Sierra's whisper caught in her throat. For the first time in years, Ethan felt his father's presence, strong and undeniable. His voice, after death, resonated louder than it had in his final days. He spoke for Ethan, and Ethan remained silent, letting the words settle on the table like stones. There was no gloating, no triumphant smirk, just calm and composure, exactly as his father had instructed. The attorney's words echoed through the room like thunderclaps. Silence fell, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of paper. Ethan sat motionless, arms crossed, feeling his pulse quicken in his chest. His father's voice, captured in those lines, had broken through the web of lies Claudia had spun. He hadn't abandoned Ethan, hadn't forgotten him. In his final moments of clarity, he had chosen Ethan, his son. Claudia was the first to break the silence, her chair scraping across the floor as she sprang to her feet. Her usually composed face was contorted with fury. She pointed a finger at the attorney. "This is absurd. Henry would never do this. He loved me, my children. This is a forgery." The attorney adjusted his glasses and calmly replied, "Mrs. Wade, the document bears your husband's signature, is notarized and legally executed. Its authenticity is beyond doubt." The attorney's certainty made her visibly pale, but she refused to give up. Her anger turned to Ethan. "It's you. You manipulated him, poisoned his mind against us." Ethan remained calm, unwilling to fuel the fire. "I didn't force my father to write these words. He made his own choice." Troy slammed his fist on the table. "This is unfair. Mom sacrificed everything for Dad. We were by his side every day while you were off doing whatever, and now he gives everything to you?" Sierra's eyes welled with tears. "We took care of him. We were there. And you barely visited him." Their words stung, for there was a kernel of truth in them. Ethan hadn't been there as often as he wished, but the reason was sitting right in front of him. Claudia had built walls between his father and him, and her children were her loyal guards. Ethan turned to them and said firmly, "You call that care? For years you used him. Every gift, every favor, every indulgence, you treated him like an atom, not a father. And now you're angry because he finally saw through it." The attorney raised a hand, calling for order. "Arguments are inappropriate. Mr. Wade's will is legally binding. The property, business assets, and personal effects are transferred to his son, Ethan Wade. The decision is final." The finality in the attorney's voice struck Claudia harder than any insult. She sank back into her chair, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. For the first time, the sharp tongue that had humiliated Ethan so many times was silent. Troy mumbled something under his breath, and Sierra, pacing the room, covered her face with her hands, expressing disbelief. For years they had mocked Ethan, ignored him, made him feel like a ghost in his father's life. And in one instant, their power crumbled. Ethan felt no joy in their downfall, only deep relief. His father's words restored Ethan's place not just in his inheritance, but in his heart. The burden he had carried since Claudia forbade him from attending the funeral began to lift. Claudia made one last attempt, leaning forward and uttering in a quiet, venomous voice, "This isn't over. You think a piece of paper makes you stronger than me? I will fight. You'll regret taking what should have been ours." The attorney sharply closed his folder. "You are welcome to litigate, Mrs. Wade, but I assure you, you will lose. Your husband clearly expressed his will." Her hate-filled eyes bored into Ethan, but he refused to be provoked. He maintained a calm, impassive, and unwavering expression. His silence was more powerful than any reply. Shedding the shackles of doubt and finding self-assurance, Ethan rose from his chair, feeling firm ground beneath his feet. Looking at the attorney, he nodded in appreciation for the support. Then his gaze shifted to Claudia, Troy, and Sierra. Words were unnecessary. Their faces, once radiating smugness and arrogance, were now contorted with fear and disbelief. Their certainty of power over him had vanished, replaced by the realization of lost control. Leaving the law office, Ethan felt an unprecedented liberation. The warm, bright rays of the afternoon sun seemed to welcome his rebirth. For the first time in years, he felt acknowledged and seen. His father's presence was not a fading memory, but a firm voice guiding him through life. The envelope he received contained not only material wealth, but something far greater: dignity and confirmation of his father's love. Truth had triumphed, Claudia's lies crumbled, and his father's love resonated louder than any cruelty. In that moment, he realized the battle was over. Stepping out of the building, he felt a multi-year burden lift from his shoulders. The sun shone brighter than ever before, and he could breathe deeply, freed from oppressive anger and grief. The sealed envelope, once in his pocket, was now empty, but its contents had changed his life forever. Claudia, Troy, and Sierra had tried to rewrite his father's story, turning him into a mere financier of their desires, erasing Ethan from his life. They had treated him like an invisible man, a stranger in his own family. For years, Ethan had doubted himself, tormented by the thought that perhaps his father truly no longer cared for him. But now, those doubts had vanished. His father's words, written in his own hand, shattered the lies they had spun for so long. His father remembered him, loved him, and chose him when it mattered most. He had restored the connection Claudia had tried to destroy, and with that came a long-awaited peace. But peace wasn't the only thing Ethan found. Claudia's parting words echoed in his head. "This isn't over." He knew she wouldn't accept defeat. She would fight to the bitter end, not out of love for his father, but out of hatred for losing. She would try to distort the truth in court, but he was ready for it. For years, he had allowed her to dictate the terms of his relationship with his father, avoiding conflict and hoping for peace. Now he understood that his silence was his strength, the silence of patience, of discipline, of a son who refused to stoop to her level. When the truth came out, his composure gave him a dignity she could never strip away. He realized that revenge wasn't about shouting and insults, but about remaining steadfast when others expected you to fall. The inheritance Ethan received was significant. The business his father had built from the ground up represented immense value, but nothing compared to the simple phrase in the will, "To my son, Ethan Wade, who always was and always will be my blood." Those words were worth more than any check, any deed, or any account statement. They were proof that love could not be erased, no matter how hard anyone tried. In the following weeks, Ethan began to sort through his father's belongings. The faint scent of his cologne still lingered in his study, and notes in his handwriting lay on the desk. He found photo albums that Claudia had tried to hide, filled with pictures of him and his father over the years. Fishing trips, baseball games, birthdays, quiet evenings at home. Each photograph reminded him that the man he remembered was real, and his love was not a dream. The events he had experienced were not merely a fleeting dream, but a harsh reality that left an indelible mark on his soul. Delving into the past, resurrecting painful memories, became an act of catharsis, a liberation from the oppressive weight of loss. For the first time since his father's death, Ethan no longer felt orphaned, deprived of parental love. Instead, he felt gratitude for an invaluable gift, the chance to restore a lost connection, to reclaim the image of the father he knew and loved. Claudia and her offspring vanished from Ethan's life as suddenly as they had appeared. Snippets of gossip reached him about her unsuccessful attempts to contest the will, but his father's foresight and the attorney's professionalism left her no chance. The more ferocious her fight became, the more desperate and pathetic she appeared in the eyes of those around her. Eventually, her threats subsided, replaced by a heavy silence. Ethan never encountered Troy or Sierra again, though deep down, he hoped that life's adversities would teach them a lesson they so stubbornly refused to learn under their mother's patronage. After all, arrogance and haughtiness only thrive as long as someone encourages them, and Ethan's father had finally put an end to that. One evening, in his father's study, Ethan realized the main lesson his father had left him. Life is not what others try to take away, but what you must fiercely fight for when the world tries to snatch it from your hands. Claudia sought to erase him from his father's memory, to disinherit him, but her malicious intentions shattered against the strong wall of parental love. Yes, his father made mistakes, but ultimately found the strength to correct them. This conscious choice brought Ethan long-awaited healing. He gained the opportunity to mourn his father not as a stranger, which he feared he had become, but as a loving parent who left behind the truth. Stepping onto the porch of his father's house, gazing at the land his father had cultivated for many years, Ethan felt a surge of determination. He vowed to honor his father's memory not with bitterness and resentment, but with a life full of the dignity his father had restored to him. Therefore, in telling this story, Ethan aims not to speak of revenge or gloating. It is a testament that patience, love, and inner strength can stand against cruelty and lies. Claudia believed she had won by forbidding him from attending the funeral, mocking him during the will reading, and gloating that he was no longer a family member. But ultimately, his father's words, sealed in that memorable envelope, resonated far louder and more convincingly than all her vile antics. And it is this realization that Ethan carefully holds in his heart. This is a story about how a stepmother tried to erase him from his father's life, and how a parent's last words restored justice. Ethan shares it, knowing there are others who have faced betrayal, rejection, and have been forced to fight alone for their place in the world. If you have ever felt alienated and alone, remember, dignity and patience possess immeasurably greater power than any cruelty.